Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Sachs, ELNET Southeast Director, and I'd like to welcome all of you back to ELNET's Monday briefing. It's the 548th day of Israel's multi-front war, started by Hamas terrorists on October 7th, 2023. It's also the 548th day of captivity for 59 people. Some are alive, but unfortunately most are not. And they're all being held somewhere, hostage, in the bowels of Gaza. Above ground, the IDF has renewed its land and air campaigns to eradicate Hamas and hopefully bring those hostages home. Phase 2 of the ceasefire deal is but a distant memory at this point. In the north, the IAF is using its air dominance to continue culling Hezbollah leadership and supplies in both Lebanon and Syria. And it's a warning to other countries, particularly Turkey, that Israel is not going to allow a military buildup on its northern border. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in D.C. today, meeting with President Trump, purportedly about tariffs, which could force up to 28,000 Israelis to lose their job and reduce Israel's revenue by $2.6 billion. However, some believe there's more to this meeting. Bibi wouldn't travel all the way to D.C. just to talk taxes. Iran is really what's served up on this menu. With a relatively defenseless Iran, a weakened regime, and a clock ticking away on the 2-month Trump ultimatum, it's anyone's guess when and what will come from this confab. Last but not least, European countries are maneuvering to minimize fallout from Trump's tariff barrage, which means figuring out how to finance defense spending and mitigate a possible global recession. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is trying to keep EU countries working together, but she's finding resistance from constituent countries' self-interest. All this is to say that ELNET's work has never been more important, and the opportunities for us have never been more abundant. For the first time in approximately 80 years, the shackles have been removed from Europe's military investment capabilities, and ELNET is uniquely positioned to help Israeli and European policymakers further their alignment in key areas of defense and technology cooperation. What's more, Israel has proven itself the king of the hill, and it's not the only democracy in the Middle East that matters. It's proving itself to be a resilient one. Yes, internal tensions are roiling Israeli society, but similar tensions are roiling all Western democracies right now. Perhaps this is just another shared value we can all appreciate. As many of you know, ELNET delegations are a powerful, experiential way to introduce European policymakers to Israel's strategic value. Already in 2025, ELNET has led 9 delegations, and by the end of this month, we'll be averaging almost 3 per month. The most recent one, last week, is apropos of today's conversation, because it was a delegation of international journalists. And today's guest is an accomplished journalist herself. As you can imagine, these delegations are getting more expensive, and with an uncertain economic future, they are likely to get more expensive. But I'll tell you what, they are the best return on investment out of the entire pro-Israel community's ecosystem. The pro-Israel political community in the US invests hundreds of millions of dollars each year just to maintain the status quo, whereas a small fraction of that investment in ELNET and Europe would create tremendous upside growth in the Europe-Israel relationship. That's leverage, and it's the single most important metric when deciding where your investment dollars should go. So, if you have not yet contributed to our 2025 campaign, please make that investment today. Invest in the Europe-Israel relationship. Thank you. And now on to our guest, Yardena Schwartz. In another day and time, I might say to all of you, don't walk to the bookstore, run to the bookstore to buy Ghosts of a Holy War. But since we don't go to bookstores anymore, I will say go to Amazon or wherever you buy your books and buy this book. It is a captivating and richly textured book. Yardena is an award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer who was based in Israel for a decade until 2023. Her reporting has appeared in the New York Times, New York Book Review of Books, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Time, National Geographic, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and many other publications. Yardena previously worked at NBC News, including stints at The Today Show, Nightly News with Brian Williams, and MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell Reports. She graduated with honors from Columbia Journalism School in 2011, received an Emmy nomination for her work at MSNBC in 2013, and the RNA Award for Excellence in Magazine Reporting in 2016. And if by chance her name rings a bell, It may be because at the end of Dan Senor's Call Me Back, her name is, he says her name as the executive editor of Dan's ARC Media. So with that, Yardena, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we jump into 100 years of history here, would you take a couple of minutes to let us know who Yardena Schwartz is? Where did you come from? How did you get to Israel? And what was it like reporting in Israel for nearly a decade?
So I grew up in New Jersey. Nothing super remarkable about that. But in 2013, I moved to Israel, both as a Zionist and as a journalist. I had been working in New York in TV news production for about 5 years, and I had always wanted to be a print journalist reporting from abroad. And so Israel was just an obvious choice for me when I decided I wanted to just quit my job at MSNBC and become an international freelance correspondent. And I moved to Tel Aviv. And my plan was to be there for just a few years, kind of earn my chops, and then move back to New York and maybe get a staff job as, a foreign correspondent for a newspaper or a magazine. But I just really loved freelancing, and I really, really loved living in Tel Aviv. I kind of, even after living there for 10 years, I always felt like I was on vacation there. And being a freelancer was something I loved so much because I had the freedom to pursue the stories I wanted to pursue, stories that I was passionate about, stories that I felt were flying under the radar that other people weren't covering. And so I would approach a story first and then, approach different editors at various magazines and newspapers to see who would be interested in publishing that story. So that was what I was doing for 10 years while living in Israel. And in 2019, I began working on this book, my first book, which was just published in October of 2024.
And let's talk about that. Let's talk about particularly the man who was lost and found to history, David Shainberg. How did you get introduced to him? You have a little reference in there that somehow you met the family of David Shainberg. So tell us how you met the family. Tell us a little bit about David, and then why did you think this would be worthy of a book? And how did
So
you know it would be worthy of a book? What point did it click in your head that this was such an incredible story that it warranted a book?
Yeah, so the protagonist in my book, at least in the first half of the book, is a young American from Memphis, Tennessee, named David Shainberg. His family in Memphis, his descendants in Memphis, discovered a box of letters in their attic in 2009 when they were moving to a new home. And they had not known that this box of letters from the 1920s was sitting in their attic. They knew very little about David or how he had been killed. David, had actually moved to what was then British Mandate Palestine in 1928. He sailed there on a ship that took him 2 weeks to arrive from New York Harbor to Palestine in 1928. And the reason he moved there was to study at what was then the most prestigious yeshiva in the land of Israel. At the time, it was extremely rare for young American Jewish men to leave their families and move across the world to study Torah. Now it's quite common, but at the time, his family thought he was insane, and his parents actually were against his move, didn't support his move. He actually had his ticket, which was then worth about $60. Today would be worth about $4,000. It was paid for by an early religious Zionist leader named Rabbi Wolf Gold. But again, these letters had just been sitting in a box in Memphis for decades until his family discovered them in 2009. And over the course of a decade, they tried to just, sift through them, organize them, digitize them, and archive them. And finally, in about 2019, they realized they were sitting on a treasure trove of history that needed to be told. And they went looking for an author who would do something with these letters. And at the time, they actually went to Yossi Klein Halevi, who is, in my opinion, the best person writing about Israel today. If you don't know his work, I highly encourage you to go read his books, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, Like Dreamers, I kind of used his book as sort of a model of what I wanted my book to be, because what he did with Like Dreamers was take, real life characters and real life events and make them read like a novel. And that's one of the best compliments I get from people who've read my book is that, it reads like a novel, but it's all true. It's all real people.
Hmm.
Anything in inside quotes is actually from a conversation that took place, or from somebody's diaries or letters. And Yossi, when he met this family and read just one of David's letters, he was captivated by their story, but he couldn't take on the project himself. And he promised this family that he would find them someone who could. And I'm honored to say that that very day that he met with his family in Jerusalem, they had come to Jerusalem to meet with him from Memphis. He emailed me asking me if I would want to be introduced to this family and take on telling this story and being entrusted with David's letters. And of course, I immediately said yes, but how do you write a book? Because I had been writing, feature stories, magazine length stories, but never had I taken on a work like this. And this book covers about 100 years of history, and it was quite the undertaking. And Yossi was kind and generous enough to take me under his wing and mentor me throughout this process. And I am forever grateful to him and also to the family in Memphis. David's great niece, Jill Notowich, who today is very active in the pro Israel space. Her husband is actually the president of the Jewish Federation of Memphis. They do a lot of fundraising for Israel and various causes, particularly around pluralism in Israel. So I think it's really interesting how how David's family is still, carrying out
Hmm.
his legacy through the work that they do.
Well, that's quite an endorsement from Yossi Klein Halevi, and you couldn't ask for a better mentor. I will bring another author, another author into this that reminds me of your book, and he's not from the Jewish world, but it's very James Michener-like, your book, in that it's centered around one location. And it reminds me a little, anybody who read The Source, it's kind of like The Source, where you're digging through the different levels of Hebron and you're telling the story from there. So wonderful book. Now, you wrote this
Thank you
book,
so
you
much.
said in 2019, you couldn't possibly have known what would transpire in 2023. What went through your mind at that point in time? Because we're going to get to the threads that link September 29 to 10/7. But what was going through your mind at the moment that that happened?
I think for all of us, October 7th was an extremely haunting, chilling, almost unfathomable day to this day. It's still hard for us to believe what happened. But I think for me, it had this other level of just surreal nature in the sense that I had spent the last 4 years before October 7th reading testimonies and accounts of what had happened to the Jewish community of Hebron in 1929 on another Shabbat morning, Sabbath morning, August 24th, 1929, when every Jewish home had been locked, doors closed, windows closed, people cowering in fear, hiding behind closets, beneath beds, waiting for the rioters that were outside to get to them, and hearing the screams of the people in the houses next to them or on the floors below them. They lived in apartments. And to read the testimonies and to see the videos that emerged on October 7th, um, you know, the the repetition of history, is something that people speak about a lot. But for me, it really felt like I was watching those testimonies and those letters from 1929 and those images that I had seen from the photographs come to life. And really, just so much of what happened on October 7th really was just a repeat on a mass scale of what happened on August 24th, 1929. Both the atrocities themselves were chillingly similar. On August 24th, 1929, babies were slaughtered in their mother's arms. Children watched as their parents were butchered by their own neighbors. Women and teenage girls were raped. Men were castrated. And ancient synagogues, were looted and destroyed. And the thousands of rioters who perpetrated this massacre, they were shouting, over and over again, Allahu Akbar, praising Islam, claiming to be defending Al-Aqsa Mosque as they slaughtered innocent men, women, and children. And that is almost exactly what we saw on October 7th in the hundreds of hours of footage that Hamas fighters and other militants uploaded to social media. And, in the terrorist videos themselves, you hear them shouting Allahu Akbar and glorifying Islam and praising, the defense of Al-Aqsa against this supposed Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa, which is exactly what led to the riots of 1929 as well. So, I mean, for me, I think I had this sort of historic perspective to the view of October 7th that many people may not have had. The shock was there for me as well, but there was also a sense of, not not so much shock that it was happening, but that something like this could happen again. Because throughout the time that I was writing this book, I never once, even for a second, imagined that something like what happened in 1929 could happen again in our lifetime. And on October 7th, I was still writing this book. I was about halfway through my manuscript, and I ended up needing to essentially rewrite the entire book because while I had always been writing about this massacre in 1929 and its impact today and its reverberations throughout history to this day, suddenly after October 7th, it became hauntingly relevant in a way that I never hoped my book would be. But I needed to kind of take those historical parallels and incorporate them into the book. And so, the book very much changed after October 7th, but it's still very much about David and his journey to Hebron, what drew him there, what life was like in Hebron before that massacre really shattered centuries of coexistence between Jews and Muslims in the city of Abraham, the forces that led to that shattering of peace, and the forces that have continued to shatter any hopes for peace, because those forces really began in 1929. And that's why I think this book is so important, because it shows how, peace has always been possible and it's still possible today. But I think that our tendency to try to move on so quickly and to try to kind of just pick up the pieces, I think that, that has a very, strong meaning and purpose, but it can't come at the expense of learning from the lessons of history, because these lessons are very clear. And it is that the fact that the powers of disinformation and the galvanizing power of disinformation surrounding Al-Aqsa and the
Mhm.
weaponization of Islam have been really ignored throughout history. And they play such a central role in fueling so much violence. And we can't afford to keep ignoring those lessons of history.
You alluded to something that reminded me of my favorite quote by Mark Twain, which is history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And you ended with my recent favorite quote by Truman, which is, there's nothing new in the world except that which you haven't yet read in history, which reinforces the need to understand what happened in the past to understand what's going on in the present so we can move forward into the future. Now, and the repetition of history is just one of the many themes that I want to explore in your book. But before we get there, I want to talk about something you mentioned to me last week. And it was your disappointment in how your book is being received by the mainstream press. Could you talk about who in the mainstream press you think should have paid attention to this? And, you know, why? Why do you think they're not giving this very important historical piece the time it deserves?
So, as you mentioned in your introduction, I come from liberal media. I come from the world of mainstream media. I worked at NBC News, MSNBC. I also worked at ABC News. I've written for dozens of publications like Time Magazine, the New York Review of Books, Foreign Policy, New York Times. All of these publications, perhaps naively, I thought that out of all of them, not all of, I didn't think all of them would cover my book, but I thought at least one. I mean, I don't think that was too unrealistic to hope for, but I guess looking back now, maybe it was, because none of the publications I have written for, at least within the liberal media sphere, have even mentioned my book. Not a single literary publication has covered my book. And, if you're in the literary world, if you're a library worker who's ordering the books that you're going to sell at your library or independent bookstore, it's often from those literary publications that you make your decisions and how to stack your shelves. And it's pretty clear if you look around indie bookstores, or if you look at, the books the New York Times and other liberal publications are covering, this doesn't fit this narrative, although it is all based in facts. And of course, I am, this book doesn't just show the flaws of one side of this conflict. It is very open about the flaws of, the mistakes Israel has made throughout the years as well, because nobody's perfect, of course. And yet I feel as if simply because this book goes against the conventional wisdom of how this conflict has been portrayed for decades, and how, particularly today, it is being depicted as this, conflict of an aggressor versus a victim, and it's nothing more than that. There's no nuance in the way this conflict is being portrayed in so many sectors of the media and the literary world, which claim to elevate nuance and claim to represent the ethos of asking questions and countering conventional wisdom and challenging preconceptions and often misconceptions. Yet when it comes to this conflict, all of that goes out the window. And I've seen it myself. I mean, my book has gotten wonderful coverage that I'm so grateful for, but all of that coverage has been in the Jewish press or the conservative press, which I think is really interesting given my background and, me being a liberal Zionist. I am not a conservative person. Yet, my book was featured in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Free Beacon, but not in, the publications I worked for, and wrote for and have written for over a decade and still write for.
Yeah, it's a real shame because it has lessons in there for both sides, or for all sides, I should say, and for everybody.
And that comes
You know,
from one of the key, sorry, just to follow up on that, that
hmm,
was one of the pieces of advice Yossi Klein Halevi gave me so much invaluable advice throughout the years. But one of the things he told me in the very beginning of my research in this book, he said, if your book angers both sides, then you've done a good job. Like if you get criticism from both sides, then you've done it right. And that was a lesson he gave me for my journalism as well. And I think that's something that's played out in the critics' receipt of my book, if you will. It's I'm really grateful. It's gotten amazing reviews, and the only kind of criticism I've seen is from those whose political sensitivities might be challenged, and that's on both sides.
over the weekend, I read a very interesting J Post article that got me thinking about some of the things that we were going to discuss today about your book, and it was about psychological warfare, and it was understanding your adversaries, perspective finding. You really need to understand the culture of your adversary if you're going to defeat your adversary, or at least prevent your adversary from advancing. And there was something in the article that said incitement is the driving force behind terrorism. If we dry up incitement, there will be no terrorism. And part of it is that these societies are driven by fear. It's not driven by the value system that we think. Well, let's just expect them to know what's right or wrong. In much of the Palestinian community right now, and much of the West Bank, and certainly as Gaza, it's controlled by fear. And incitement is one of the ways to get everybody going. And that was a theme in your book. And you mentioned it a moment ago, but I think it's worth exploring a little further. Incitement around Al-Aqsa. We have seen that repeatedly. And if you read your book, and I started reading Orrin Kessler's book, who mentions you, by the way, so I saw that in his book. Both of you talk about the real effort by the Yishuv to quiet any incitement, that they wanted to quiet any rumors that were spreading that there was any Jewish attempt to overtake the Dome of the Rock, the Temple Mount, back. So could you explore the role of Al-Aqsa and incitement over the last 100 years?
Yeah, so Al-Aqsa Mosque, for those who don't know too much about it, It's the third holiest site in Islam in general, but within Palestine and the land of Israel, for Muslims living in Israel, for Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, it is the holiest site on this land. It was built atop the ruins of the ancient Jewish temples on what's known as the Temple Mount, which is the single holiest site in Judaism. It's the direction to which Jews today around the world pray and have prayed for thousands of years. And the holiest site that was accessible to Jews in 1929, at the time, that these riots took place, was the Western Wall, the last remnant still standing of the Second Temple. So it's about 2,000 years old. And at the time, Muslims were in control of the Temple Mount, the entire area of the Temple Mount, which included the Western Wall. And because the Supreme Muslim Council had ownership over the Western Wall, they could control Jewish access to that wall. And around 1928, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amina Husseini, the most powerful Muslim official in Palestine at the time, essentially the equivalent of the chief rabbi of Palestine, he began a rumor claiming that the Jews of Palestine, who were increasingly coming to the Western Wall to pray because the Jewish population of Palestine at the time was increasing. He claimed that those Jews who were praying at the Western Wall were really seeking to turn the Western Wall into a synagogue, and then from there to take over Al-Aqsa, destroy the mosque, and rebuild their ancient temple. And he started that rumor because for years prior to that, he had been facing allegations of corruption, nepotism, misuse of religious funds. And once he started that rumor, it really spread like wildfire. And, it was repeated in mosques throughout Palestine. It was published by the Arabic press and in city squares across Palestine. And once that rumor took hold of the Muslim population of Palestine, and they had now this, much more significant threat to their livelihood. They were a very religious population. To this day, Palestinians are among the most religious Muslims in the world. That was really successful for him because after that, he lost almost all of that criticism in the Arabic press. Suddenly, much of all of the criticism was against the Jewish population, which was still then a minority. It was only 20% of the Palestinian population at that point was Jewish. And I say Palestinian because under the British rule, all people living in
Mm-hmm.
British Mandate Palestine were Palestinians, both Jews and Arabs. So, this what we see today with the continuation of this rumor, this lie that the Jews seek to destroy Al-Aqsa to rebuild their ancient temple, it began then with a corrupt Arab Palestinian leader seeking to distract his people from his own inability to improve their lives, his own, apathy toward them. He continued to be extremely corrupt and to misappropriate funds for his own use, but he was able to do so without the criticism and opposition of much of what he had faced before he started that rumor. And because of that rumor, he was able to incite the masses 1 year later, around Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, the holiest, most sorrowful day in the Jewish calendar, when 10,000 Jews went to pray at the Western Wall. And the day after that mass prayer, there were a few hundred young Jewish activists who marched to the Western Wall protesting against the British failure to protect Jewish worshippers from increasing Muslim attacks. Those attacks were, of course, a direct result of the Grand Mufti's propaganda campaign. And the British, after all, had appointed the Grand Mufti to his post. Like, they should have been countering that disinformation campaign. They should have been ensuring safe Jewish access to the Western Wall, which was the holiest place Jews were permitted to pray in Palestine. And yet they didn't. For a year, they ignored the complaints of the Jewish population. And so this march was actually a protest against the British, But the Grand Mufti and the Arabic press claimed that this Jewish march had been violent. There were lies spread throughout the Arabic press claiming that Jewish protesters had raped Muslim women, had cursed the Prophet Muhammad, had beat Muslim men. None of that had happened. None of that was true. But the truth had become irrelevant as a result of this year-long propaganda campaign.
And
And
the
the
Al
very
Aqsa,
next,
I was going to say the Al
sorry,
Aqsa rumor played itself out throughout history too. It was the spark that led to the Second Intifada with the claims that Ariel Sharon and Jews were going to take back Al Aqsa. And Hamas's invasion into Israel is known as the Al Aqsa flood. So it's a
that's right.
theme that really seems to work throughout history for the Palestinians.
And that's only two examples. I mean, the Second
Yeah.
Intifada for Palestinians in Arabic, that is known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. And to this day, they will claim that this is what they were doing. They were protecting Al-Aqsa. And after the Al-Aqsa flood, as Hamas named its attack on October 7th, you might recall that in the days after that, Hamas was hoping to open new fronts in the war. And he called on Palestinians in the West Bank and Arab Israelis within the state of Israel to flood Al-Aqsa. Thankfully, they didn't listen, and Israel, did all it could to
Hmm.
prevent that flood from happening. But even in the pamphlets that were seen across college campuses in the United States, there was this same imagery about Al-Aqsa and the same language of, flooding the streets. Hamas's headbands have, and their logo has this same lie that began in 1929 with, Al-Aqsa in the background, a gun in front of it. It's all about this idea that Hamas is, the defender of Al-Aqsa against the Jews, and they're just the latest defender. Sadly, the Palestinians have really been the ones to suffer the most from this use
Hmm.
by corrupt Palestinian leaders of religion to galvanize support and distract from the real problems they face.
And that's just one of the many themes throughout your book. So I'm gonna I want you to paint the picture, but I'm gonna provide the palette. And the palette are the themes. So rather than me asking you specific details about history, I want to provide you the themes that resonated with me, and I'd like you to decide which ones that you think are the most important and weave the story around it. One struck me as hope is not armor. Throughout history, the ones who hoped the most, who hewed the most to peace, were generally the first to die. Actions have opposite and equal reactions. On repeated occasions throughout history, there was movement by the British to stop Zionism, by the Arabs to squash Zionism, both then and now. But the response has been tremendous, both then and now, in different ways. Arab gaslighting, just like we have seen from October 7th, the complete discounting of Arab atrocities by the Arab population. It didn't happen. It's all Israeli propaganda. The very same thing happened following Hebron massacre. Land for peace, I found very interesting theme throughout this history, and also the evolution of Zionism. I found that to be interesting because Zionism has had different faces between 1929 and 2025. And the other one sort of is role reversal. And if you want to get into this, that's fine too. It's one of your themes. But there was the police chief Caffaretta, and we heard what was happening, those standing by to the Jews being beaten while people in authority stood by. And just last week, there was an article in the Times of Israel talking about how Palestinians have been accusing the IDF of standing by and not doing anything. And there seems to be an interesting role reversal based on any number of things, but I think it's largely human nature. Paint us a picture with the themes that I just laid out for you.
So one of them brought me back to our conversation surrounding what I was thinking on October 7th, to how I was feeling on October 8th and 9th and 10th. And that was another just shocking level of history repeating itself because the immediate denial of the atrocities that had taken place that we saw after October 7th, simultaneously blaming those atrocities on the Jewish victims. That exact same thing happened in the immediate aftermath of the massacre in Hebron in 1929, when 67 unarmed Jewish men, women, and children were slaughtered by their neighbors. And what happened was the Arab leaders of Palestine and the Arabs of Hebron themselves, in the immediate days afterwards, outright denied that those atrocities had taken place and went so far as to blame those atrocities on their Jewish victims. There was one particular statement that always stands out to me in my mind, and it was literally titled Scandals of Jewish Propaganda. It was put out by the Arab Executive, which was kind of the Council of Arab Leaders in Palestine at the time, including the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And it claimed that the Jews in Hebron were not slaughtered by their Arab neighbors, but by Jewish yeshiva students who wanted to raise funds from the Jewish diaspora. This is just one of the claims they made after the massacre in Hebron. And, on a kind of bigger picture level, the British, not only had they failed absolutely in their duty to protect their Jewish subjects. After all, the British, their mandate was to create a Jewish home in Palestine, not a Jewish state, but a Jewish home, a place where Jews could be safe from the anti-Semitism and violence and pogroms that had led them to flee Eastern Europe. And they had either watched this violence unfold, or the Arab policemen, who were overwhelmingly the members of the police force in Hebron and elsewhere, actively participated in the massacre. And when the British carried out a commission, they sent a royal commission from London to Palestine to investigate the causes of the riots, and they held hundreds of hours of hearings with people like the Grand Mufti, with Jewish officials, with British officials. And I read that testimony, and I read these hundreds of pages of hearings they held, and it's absolutely clear what led to these riots. The incitement, the failure of the British to protect the Jews, whether it was in the leading up to the massacre, in not combating the disinformation, not protecting Jewish access to the Western Wall, but also on that day, not doing enough to protect Jews from these riots in Hebron and also in other parts of Palestine. Yet in the end, their conclusion in that report was that Jewish immigration should be limited to allay the fears of the Arab population of Palestine, and Jewish land purchases should be limited as well. Notice the keyword land purchases, because contrary to so much of the propaganda we hear today about, Zionists stealing land in Palestine, none of this land was stolen. It was purchased by from wealthy Arab landowners, many of them absentee landowners. And though many of those men who were selling their land to Jews in Palestine would then go back to their people and claim that Jews were stealing the land, when at the end of the day, it was they were profiting from these land sales. And sometimes there were tenant farmers, Arab tenant farmers who were living off that land, who then lost access to that land. You would think that those wealthy Arab landowners would pay those people, compensate those people. And they didn't. It was often Zionist groups that were purchasing the land that compensated these Arab farmers. Nevertheless, the British concluded that not only had Jewish immigration led to fear among the Palestinian population, resulting in these vicious riots, but also that this peaceful demonstration at the Western Wall had been the spark to ignite the riots. So, on a micro scale and on a macro scale, Jews were blamed for their suffering in the immediate aftermath of the massacre of 1929, much like we're being blamed for our suffering today. And, another question you asked about the evolution of Zionism. One of the things that interested me so much about David's letters when I first read them back in 2019 was the fact that he was an anti-Zionist. He, in his letters, it was almost mind-boggling for me to read, because I wasn't so familiar with the anti-Zionism of the 1920s among the traditional Jewish population, whether it was in the U.S. or in Palestine. But many traditional Jews in Palestine at the time rejected Zionism, not because they rejected, the return to Zion and the belief in, the right of Jews to live in our ancient homeland. That they accepted, but it was because Zionism was seen as a secular movement. This was why many of them rejected it. And in Hebron, this was the epitome of an anti-Zionist population. These were pious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the Torah. In 1904, when a Zionist group had wanted to hold a memorial for Theodor Herzl, shortly after his death in Hebron, the Jewish leaders of Hebron rejected it unanimously. They said, we're not a Zionist community. We're, very traditional. So the fact that it was this community of pious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the Torah that suffered the heaviest losses and the most gruesome brutality during the riots of 1929 really changed the dynamic around Zionism in Palestine. So, many of those who had opposed Zionism until then, thinking it was, the Jewish return to Zion would have to depend on the will of God and the arrival of the Messiah. Many of those who had believed that until then now embrace Zionism and agreed that Jews would only be safe in our homeland under the protection of our own army, because clearly no foreign power could be depended upon for our safety. And I think a similar lesson was realized after October 7th, that Israel would need to do what it needed to do, regardless of what the international community claimed when there were immediate calls for a ceasefire right after October 7th. I think there was a realization that, the international community didn't understand what was happening here if they were calling for Israel to cease fire right after October 7th. And in the same way that we're seeing so many Jews around the world really reconnect with their Judaism, with their Jewish community, in the face of this unprecedented level of anti-Semitism that many of us never thought we would witness in our lifetime, we saw a similar strengthening of Zionism in the aftermath of the massacre of 1929 in a very different way.
Mhm.
But what's very clear throughout history is that these, really violent outbursts of, whether it's an intifada, whether it's an attack on Israel, they always seem to have, a counterproductive um, consequence to what the perpetrators of that violence might have hoped. So if the Grand Mufti may have hoped that the riots of 1929 would force, would force the British to abandon the Jews and the Jews to abandon Palestine and leave their hopes of reestablishing a Jewish home in Palestine, that didn't come to pass. The British definitely wavered in their commitment to
Mhm.
establishing a Jewish home, but the Jewish population of Palestine only strengthened their resolve to establish a Jewish state.
There,
And of course,
there's also a very unsettling realization that was poignantly pointed out in your book in a scene that is reflected today as well. And that is a Sephardi woman, Jewish, obviously, Sephardi woman whose family had been there for 400 years, turning to the people who were beating her husband, saying, "Why are you doing this? We're indigenous. If you're not indigenous after 400 years, what are you?" And I think the same thing that we saw following October 7th, with the streets filled in this country, particularly with marchers saying, "Go back to wherever you came from," that Jews, there was an unsettling realization, even to American Jews, that if after all this time, we're still not fully accepted. And so it's an interesting realization and juxtaposition over the past century. I'm going to pause there for a word from our sponsor, Sari Steinberg, Midwest Director for ELNET. And then I'm going to ask you one final question, and then we're going to get to questions that are being submitted. Sari.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, Yardena, for your illuminating presentation. I look forward to hearing more shortly and to reading your book that I didn't know about until recently. I also would like to thank everyone who joined this briefing. Some of you are regulars, some of you are new. All of you are invited to attend our briefings at this time every Monday, except for next week when it's Passover. but almost every single Monday at this time. I also want to encourage you to please consider coming to the International Policy Conference next month, May 18th to 20th in Paris. These conferences are held only every other year, and they are a unique glimpse, a rare glimpse into what ELNET usually does behind closed doors, bringing together high-level policymakers, be they MPs, ministers, military experts, or advisors, to discuss shared concerns and thereby strengthen the relationships between Israel and various European countries, as well as the EU as a whole. ELNET Diplomacy Club membership is a prerequisite for attending the conference, and that starts with a tax-deductible contribution of $1,800 or more for 2025, with higher membership levels and additional benefits at various increments. Please note that for $5,000, you can cover the cost of bringing a European official on an ELNET delegation to Israel, which gives them a new perspective and activates their advocacy for pro-Israel legislation as a result. I'd be happy to go on and on about specific examples, but I don't want to be too long here. One more thing, even if you can't make it to the conference, please consider joining the Diplomacy Club and contributing at the level you're able. You may want to take inspiration from one of my Midwest friends and supporters, ELNET supporters, who said she can't make it to Paris this time, but she is going to contribute the amount she would have spent on the trip. So thank you to that supporter. And lastly, I wish you a happy Passover. And I know we all pray that it is truly the holiday of freedom for all of the remaining hostages.
Thank you, Sari, very much for that. All right, so my last question, Yardena, as you know, ELNET works in approximately 37 European countries, plus NATO and the European Parliament, to broaden and deepen relationships between Israel and those countries. What are the 3 or 4 lessons that you think we on this call, members of Parliament and policymakers who are on this call, can take from your history? From your lessons, what are the lessons that we can take and perhaps change the future to ensure that it doesn't run the way the last 100 years have run?
That's a great question, and thanks so much for asking it. One thing I think is really to understand the devastating impact disinformation has had on the people of Israel and Palestine over the last century, and how that disinformation has been weaponized by corrupt Palestinian leaders to maintain their own power. We've seen it not just from the Grand Mufti and from Hamas, but also from Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas. So it's not just Hamas that is perpetrating these lies that the Grand Mufti began in 1929. The Palestinian Authority and Fatah also spread this lie about Al-Aqsa and this supposed Jewish plot to destroy it, which at the end of the day, we have to say is utterly insane, because if Israel truly did want to destroy Al-Aqsa and rebuild the temple, we would have done it by now. And, you know, anyone who understands the Jewish faith knows that this, the coming of the, you know, the rebuilding of the temple is not something that will be done or that anyone thinks will be done by man or by hand. It's, you know, for those who believe it, something that will happen with the coming of the Messiah. And so, you know, this disinformation isn't just coming from the people we consider, you know, the extremists. It's also being perpetrated, or sorry, being carried out in the Palestinian curriculum and in the UNRWA curriculum. So, you know, I'm not the first to say that UNRWA has played a really destructive role in fueling this conflict. I've done investigations of UNRWA for, so it's in my book, but also I wrote investigative piece for Foreign Policy magazine several years ago, in which I uncovered the kinds of lessons that are being taught in what UNRWA calls its education for peace. That's actually what it's called. And, you know, 60% of UNRWA's budget goes to this education, which is anything but peace. When I interviewed school children and also looked at their at the textbooks that are being taught in UNRWA schools and the curriculum, not once is peace taught, actually the very opposite. young school girl showed me a page of her textbook where it showed a female terrorist who committed a massacre of school children in the 1970s. This is one of the people she and her classmates are being taught to emulate as a hero of the Palestinian cause. In the UNRWA curriculum, terrorism is glorified. And this is not, hyperbole. Like, it sounds like hyperbole. It almost sounds too crazy to be true, but it is true. And the fact that UNRWA is still doing this and that the Palestinian curriculum is still teaching what amounts to child abuse, this needs to be confronted. This needs to change. This needs to end, whether it means UNRWA being eradicated or being reformed or being replaced with something else. Frankly, UNRWA has been promising reforms for years and has never actually followed through with those promises. Philip Lazzarini, the current head of UNRWA, was still the head of UNRWA back when I was writing this investigative piece for foreign policy back in 2021, and they made the same claims. Oh, we didn't know. We'll make reforms. But what ends up happening is every year they make these promises and they don't change. And then they go to the international community and say, listen, Palestinian children aren't going to get the humanitarian aid they need. And this is true. But what should have been realized long ago is that, yes, Palestinian children and Palestinian people need this humanitarian aid, but clearly UNRWA isn't capable of providing it without, ensuring that they will need that aid for centuries to come, because they're being taught to become martyrs, and that's what they should aspire to. And, what should be done is that aid should be conditioned, aid to the Palestinians, aid to UNRWA or any other body that is providing education or employment or, humanitarian aid. That aid needs to be conditioned upon reform and upon, genuine proof that this aid is going to better these people, because obviously that's not what's happening, and it has not been happening for decades. And that's if that's going to help anyone, it's the Palestinian people themselves. So, anyone who wants to be supporting a better future for Palestinians and this goal of Palestinian freedom, that's what you need to focus on. Ending this disinformation, ending the glorification of terrorism that is so rampant in the Palestinian curriculum as well as in Palestinian media. And aid is a powerful tool, and funding of the Palestinian Authority or any other Palestinian body, that is an important tool, and it should come with strings attached. I mean, I also, if you ask me about strings attached for aid to Israel, it should also, there should be, going back to your point about how, in 1929, the British police stood by as Jews were slaughtered. It's obviously very different, but the images we've seen out of the West Bank with settler vigilantes, masked settlers beating Palestinians while Israeli soldiers stand by, that is abhorrent. And that should also, that needs to be addressed as well. And I think that it's the duty of the Israeli government to ensure accountability for those people, because as of now, there's been more arrests of anti-government protesters and protesters, not even anti-government protesters. There's been more arrests of protesters demonstrating for the release of hostages in Gaza than there have been arrests of violent settlers in the West Bank. And I think that's because who we have as a national security minister in Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir, there were warnings of what, the consequences that would be for that appointment. And we're seeing them play out in front of our eyes. But, I think that the fact that more people are talking about conditioning aid to Israel than conditioning aid to the Palestinians, I think just kind of shows how there has been just this almost cancel culture, if you will, of the truth behind this conflict. So if you look in the liberal media, of which, I come from, there is often no reporting on Palestinian attacks or no reporting on the Palestinian incitement within their curriculum, coming from their religious officials. And so long as people aren't being told about these stories, so long as people are reading only about the flaws of one side and not the other, this conflict will never end, because you can't solve a problem without knowing the the conditions of the problem. And if you're only, reading about the problems of one side, you're missing half the story.
Yeah, it's a very complex, rich, and textured story that you weave, full of all these different colors and themes. And so I really do urge everyone to purchase the book and read. There's some things we didn't touch on that are in the book, like Red Tuesday, which is Martyrs Day, which started in, I think it was somewhere in the early 1930s, but it's still celebrated today. The characters are consistent throughout history, and it's something that needs to change. We have a couple of questions. I'm not going to be able to get to everyone, unfortunately. You've mentioned a couple times that you are part of the liberal press. Well, I'll put that in air quotes. He still doesn't quite understand the aversion to the truth or to Israel or to the narrative that you're trying to establish. Why? Why do you think is there something beyond just the narrative doesn't comport?
Honestly think that is what it's about. And the reason I think that is because we don't just see it with this conflict, but we've seen it in the way the media has avoided covering certain other truths. One example, during the COVID lockdowns, when there was that letter, the Great Barrington Letter, signed by many prominent health officials. That letter was treated by the mainstream press as insanity. And the people who signed it were treated as, maybe suspect in their science. And this whole idea of, following the science and only listening to the science, but only to certain science. Or, there was a tendency to dismiss any talk about the lab leak theory as being anti-science when, in hindsight, we know that that theory was true. And in hindsight, we know that the skepticism surrounding the science behind so many of those lockdowns was not true. When they went back and looked at the data on states in the U.S. that had some of the most severe lockdowns and states that had much more lenient policies, there was no difference in the deaths and the levels of disease. And we also saw it during, the Black Lives Matter protests, when those protests were treated by the mainstream press as being solely peaceful. And stories that went against that, narrative, stories that showed, that they weren't actually only peaceful, and there were many violent rioters and, really horrible consequences to this quest to defund the police. Stories like that were silenced. There's one book that I read recently by Nellie Bowles, Morning After the Revolution. It talks all about this, and she actually doesn't even mention the whole Israel-Palestine issue because her book was written before October 7th. But it talks about how this kind of, tunnel vision in the mainstream media to silence anything that counters the conventional wisdom, which goes against all the principles of what journalism is supposed to be. I mean, I went to Columbia Journalism School. I was taught to be curious and, to counter conventional wisdom and to counter accepted narratives. And it looks like we're going backwards on these values, and that journalism today is turned into more like activism and not, a seeking of truth.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We should have you back just to talk about what's going on at Columbia. Last question. It's kind of a quick question, but I don't know if it'll be a quick answer. But let's see. Mindy Stein wants to know if you explored Dar al-Islam as a motivating force, which is you. So yes, you're nodding head. You can explain it to everybody, and whether or not it was a factor in the book.
Yeah, so it's in the book. One of the reasons why the Grand Mufti rejected the first two-state solution in 1937 when it was presented by the British, and this is all in my books, you can learn more about it there, but he said that Palestine has always been and will always be Muslim land. And he didn't just reject the idea of two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state living side by side. He rejected the idea of Jews having any kind of
Unfortunately, it looks like we've lost Yardena, which means hopefully we can have her back to discuss some other topics. So with that, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the discussion. It's a little bit unlike what we've had in the past. It is certainly a book worth purchasing and reading. I hope you go and do it. We will be off, as Sari said, next Monday in observance of Passover. We will be back the following Monday. Everybody enjoy a festive Passover and next year in Jerusalem. Have a wonderful day, everybody.